On a chilly autumn evening in downtown Seattle, an elderly man in tattered clothes sat quietly on a weathered cardboard box outside a busy coffee shop. His gray beard was neatly trimmed despite his worn appearance, and his eyes held a distant look as he watched the steady stream of people walking past. Most hurried by without a glance, clutching their warm drinks and looking down at their phones. The man, known simply as Old Joe to the few locals who bothered to speak with him, had been a fixture on this corner for the past few months. What passers-by didn't know was that his story was far more complex than his current circumstances suggested. 20 years earlier, he had been Dr. Joseph Chen, one of the country's leading cardiac surgeons, with a thriving practice and a reputation for taking on the most challenging cases. As the evening crowd thinned out, a group of young men in expensive designer clothes emerged from a nearby bar, their loud laughter echoing off the buildings. One of them, wearing a gold chain and sporting a perfectly styled haircut, noticed Old Joe and nudged his friends. "Hey guys, check out our local street decoration," he sneered, pointing at the elderly man. His companions joined in, circling around Joe like vultures. "Must be nice not having to work for a living," another one taunted, pulling out his phone to record the scene. "Just sitting here all day, probably making more money than honest folks." The others laughed, encouraged by their ringleader's cruelty. Joe remained silent, his weathered hands clasped tightly in his lap. His eyes, however, held no fear, only a deep sadness and something else that the young men failed to notice, wisdom gained from a lifetime of experiences they couldn't begin to imagine. A young nurse named Amy Chen, no relation to Joe, was walking home from her shift at the nearby hospital when she witnessed the scene. Something about the quiet dignity in the homeless man's bearing made her stop. She had seen enough suffering in her work to recognize that appearances often masked deeper truths. As she watched, one of the young men kicked Joe's empty coffee cup, sending it skittering across the sidewalk. "Come on, old-timer, show us some entertainment for our donations," he laughed, pulling out a handful of coins and making a show of considering whether to throw them. Amy had seen enough. Despite her small stature, she stepped forward with the confidence of someone used to handling difficult situations. "What exactly do you think you're proving?" she asked loudly, her voice cutting through their laughter. "Does bullying an elderly man make you feel better about yourselves?" The young men turned, surprised by the interruption. The ringleader started to say something dismissive, but Amy wasn't finished. She pulled out her hospital ID badge, letting it catch the street light. "I work at the hospital right there," she pointed, "and I've seen plenty of tough guys like you crying for their mothers when facing real problems. How about showing some basic human decency?" Her words seemed to pierce through their alcohol-induced bravado. A small crowd had begun to gather, phones recording the scene, and the young men suddenly looked less certain of themselves. The ringleader muttered something about just having some fun and began to back away. Amy knelt down to help Joe pick up his scattered belongings. As she did, she noticed something that made her pause, a small, worn photo that had fallen from his pocket. It showed a younger version of Joe in surgical scrubs, standing proudly in what she recognized as one of the hospital's operating rooms. "Sir," she said quietly, "this photo, were you?" But before she could finish her question, Joe gently took the picture from her hands and tucked it away. For a brief moment, their eyes met, and Amy saw decades of untold stories in his gaze. The young thugs were still hovering nearby, their earlier bravado deflated but their curiosity piqued by this unexpected turn of events. They couldn't hear the quiet conversation between Amy and Joe, but something about the way the nurse was treating the homeless man made them uncomfortable. Perhaps, for the first time, they were beginning to realize that their assumptions about Old Joe might have been terribly wrong. As the first part of this story draws to a close, the evening grows darker, and the street lamps cast long shadows on the sidewalk. The young men's actions have set in motion a chain of events that will reveal just how wrong they were about the quiet man they chose to mock, and the consequences of their actions will reach further than any of them could have imagined. The following morning, Amy couldn't shake the image of the old homeless man in his mysterious photograph from her mind. As she prepared for her morning shift at Seattle General Hospital, she found herself drawn to the hospital's archives room during her break. Something about Joe's photograph had sparked her professional curiosity. The archives clerk, an elderly woman named Mrs. Thompson who had worked at the hospital for over 3 decades, was initially hesitant to help. But when Amy mentioned the name Dr. Joseph Chen, her eyes widened with recognition. "Dr. Chen," she whispered, as if speaking of a legend. "I haven't heard that name in years." Mrs. Thompson pulled out several old files and newspapers from the hospital's records. There, in fading ink and yellowing papers, was the story that the young thugs could never have imagined. Dr. Joseph Chen had been more than just a cardiac surgeon. He had pioneered several revolutionary procedures that had saved hundreds of lives. He was brilliant, Mrs. Thompson recalled, her eyes misting over. There was this case in 2003, a 5-year-old girl with a complex heart condition. Every other surgeon had refused to operate, saying it was too risky. But Dr. Chen. She pulled out an old newspaper clipping showing a younger Joe in his surgical gear, standing next to a smiling little girl. He spent 18 hours in surgery and saved her life. Meanwhile, across town, the group of young men who had harassed Joe were dealing with their own aftermath of the previous night's events. The ringleader, Richard Zhang, son of a prominent real estate developer, woke up to find that videos of their behavior had gone viral on social media. His father's business partners were calling, and his own workplace, a prestigious investment firm, had requested an immediate meeting. Richard sat in his luxury apartment, watching the video for the 100th time. In the harsh light of day, their actions looked even worse than he remembered. The quiet dignity of the homeless man contrasted sharply with their drunken cruelty. Comments under the video were scathing, with many calling for them to be identified and held accountable. Back at the hospital, Amy's research had revealed something else, something that made her heart ache. Dr. Chen's brilliant career had come to an abrupt halt in 2015 after a personal tragedy. His wife and teenage daughter had been killed in a car accident while he was performing emergency surgery. The patient had lived, but Dr. Chen had lost everything that mattered to him. The story pieced together through old news reports and hospital records painted a picture of a man destroyed by grief. Dr. Chen had gradually withdrawn from his practice, despite his colleagues' attempts to help. Then, one day, he simply disappeared. The medical community had lost track of one of its most brilliant minds. As Amy's shift ended, she found herself walking back to the corner where she had encountered Joe the previous night. To her surprise, he was there, sitting in the same spot, but this time reading a worn medical journal. She approached him carefully, holding 2 cups of coffee from the nearby shop. "I hope you don't mind," she said, offering him one of the cups. "I did some research today, Dr. Chen." Joe looked up, his eyes meeting hers with a mixture of resignation and something else, perhaps relief at finally being recognized. "The coffee shop owner lets me read their old magazines," he said softly, his voice carrying the refined education that his appearance belied. "It helps me stay current, even if I can't practice anymore." It was the first time he had spoken at length, and his words carried the weight of years of untold stories. Back in his apartment, Richard Zhang was facing his own crisis. His father had just called, furious about the viral video. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" his father demanded. "Your actions reflect on our entire family, our business." But something else his father said caught Richard's attention. Apparently, one of their family friends, a retired surgeon, had recognized the homeless man in the video. "That man you harassed?" his father's voice cracked with anger and disbelief. "He saved your cousin's life 15 years ago. A surgery so complex that no other doctor would attempt it. Dr. Joseph Chen was a legend in the medical community, and you treated him like garbage." The weight of this revelation hit Richard like a physical blow. He remembered being 12 years old, sitting in the hospital waiting room with his family while his cousin underwent heart surgery. He had never met the surgeon who performed the operation, had never known the man who gave his cousin a chance at life. As the day drew to a close, Amy sat with Joe outside the coffee shop, listening as he slowly began to share pieces of his story. He spoke of the years of dedicated service, the lives he had saved, and the family he had lost. But most surprisingly, he spoke without bitterness about his current circumstances. Sometimes, he said, sipping his coffee, the only way to cope with losing everything is to live with nothing. His words carried a profound wisdom that made Amy's eyes fill with tears. This man, who had once commanded operating rooms and saved countless lives, had found a different kind of peace in his voluntary exile from society. As night fell over Seattle, the story of Dr. Joseph Chen was spreading through social media like wildfire. The viral video of his harassment was being updated with his history, his achievements, and the tragic circumstances that had led to his current situation. The young men who had mocked him were about to learn a powerful lesson about judgment, compassion, and the complex paths that life can take. The next morning, Seattle woke up to find Dr. Joseph Chen's story splashed across local news websites and social media. The contrast between his brilliant medical career and current circumstances touched hearts across the city. Local news stations ran segments featuring interviews with former patients whose lives he had saved, each story more moving than the last. Richard Zhang sat in his office, barely able to focus on his computer screen. His email inbox was flooded with messages from colleagues and business associates, all expressing their disappointment in his behavior. But it was an email from his cousin Lisa that finally broke him. She had attached a scanned photo from 15 years ago, a picture of her in a hospital bed after her heart surgery, with Dr. Chen standing beside her, his hand resting gently on her shoulder. "This is the man who gave me a chance to live," Lisa wrote. "I'm alive today, able to be a mother to my 2 children, because Dr. Chen took a risk no other surgeon would take. And you mocked him on the street. I've never been more ashamed to call you family." Meanwhile, at Seattle General Hospital, Amy's morning shift was interrupted by an unusual buzz of activity. Dr. William Hayes, the chief of surgery, had called an emergency staff meeting after recognizing his former colleague in the viral video. The hospital's conference room was packed with medical staff, many of whom had worked alongside Dr. Chen years ago. Joseph Chen wasn't just a surgeon, Dr. Hayes addressed the room, his voice thick with emotion. He was an innovator, a teacher, and a humanitarian. After the tragic loss of his family, we all tried to help, but we didn't try hard enough. We let one of our own slip through the cracks. It's time we made that right. Outside the coffee shop where Joe usually sat, a small crowd had gathered. Word had spread through the neighborhood, and people were bringing flowers, cards, and donations. The coffee shop owner, Mr. Park, had tears in his eyes as he recalled the quiet man who had been reading medical journals in his shop for months. "I always knew there was something special about him," Mr. Park said, setting a fresh cup of coffee beside Joe, who seemed overwhelmed by the attention. He would help other homeless people with basic medical advice, cleaning wounds, checking for fever. Even without a proper clinic, he never stopped being a doctor. Richard Zhang watched all of this unfold through social media updates and news coverage. His father had suspended him from the family business until he could prove he understood the magnitude of his actions. Sitting alone in his apartment, Richard found himself watching videos of Dr. Chen's old lectures and interviews from medical conferences. In one particularly moving clip from 2010, Dr. Chen was discussing the importance of compassion in medicine. "Technical skill is crucial," he said, "but empathy, the ability to see the human being behind the patient, that's what makes a true healer." The irony of these words, compared to how Richard and his friends had treated him, was overwhelming. Amy had taken a special interest in Joe's case, spending her breaks talking with him and learning more about his story. She discovered that despite his circumstances, he had never lost his medical knowledge or his desire to help others. He would discreetly tend to other homeless individuals, using his expertise to provide basic medical care with whatever supplies he could access. "I couldn't save my family," Joe confided in Amy one afternoon, "but I could still help others." Sometimes, the smallest acts of kindness can keep you going when nothing else can. His words carried the weight of someone who had experienced both the heights of success and the depths of despair. The story took an unexpected turn when one of Joe's former patients, now a successful business owner named David Wu, recognized him from the news coverage. Wu had been a teenager when Dr. Chen performed life-saving surgery on him in 2008. Now, he was determined to help the man who had given him a second chance at life. "Dr. Chen didn't just fix my heart," Wu told reporters. "He spent hours talking to my terrified parents, explaining everything in terms they could understand, making sure they felt comfortable with every decision. That kind of compassion stays with you forever." Richard, watching Wu's interview on his laptop, felt something shift inside him. He remembered his own cousin's surgery, how his entire family had prayed for a miracle, and how Dr. Chen had provided that miracle. The shame of his actions became unbearable. After a sleepless night, Richard made a decision. He called his friends who had been involved in the incident, insisting they meet him at his apartment. "We need to make this right," he told them. "Not for our image, not for our family's businesses, but because it's the right thing to do." At Seattle General, Dr. Hayes and the hospital board were drafting a proposal. They wanted to create a new position, a patient advocacy role that would combine Dr. Chen's medical expertise with his unique perspective on human suffering. But first, they needed to find him and convince him that his experience, both as a surgeon and as someone who had lived on the streets, was invaluable. As the day drew to a close, Amy sat with Joe in what had become their regular evening routine. The crowd of well-wishers had finally thinned, leaving behind a mountain of cards, flowers, and notes. Joe picked up one of the cards, reading it slowly. "All these years," he said quietly, "I thought I had lost everything that mattered. I never imagined that by losing everything, would find a different way to make a difference." He looked at Amy, his eyes clear and focused. "Perhaps it's time to stop running from who I was and find a way to be who I am now." The sun set over Seattle, casting long shadows across the street where just days ago, a group of young men had mocked a homeless man without knowing his story. Now, that same corner had become a place of pilgrimage, a reminder that every person, regardless of their circumstances, has a story worth knowing and a dignity worth respecting. The following day brought unexpected visitors to Joe's usual spot outside the coffee shop. Richard Zhang, accompanied by his cousin Lisa, approached nervously. Lisa, now a mother of two, clutched a worn photo album to her chest. The morning crowd of coffee shoppers paused, many recognizing Richard from the viral video, creating an atmosphere thick with tension. Lisa stepped forward first, tears already forming in her eyes. "Dr. Chen," she said softly, "you probably don't remember me, but 15 years ago, you gave me a chance to live when no other surgeon would." She opened the album, showing photos of her hospital stay, her recovery, and then, most powerfully, pictures of her wedding and her children. Joe's weathered hands trembled slightly as he touched the photos. "Case number 2847, he said quietly, surprising everyone with his precise memory. "Double valve replacement with complications. You had a rare condition that made the surgery extremely risky." He looked up at Lisa, his eyes bright with recognition. "You wanted to become a teacher." "I did," Lisa replied, wiping tears from her eyes. "I'm teaching 3rd grade now. These are my kids, Hannah and Michael." She showed him more recent photos. "They wouldn't exist if it weren't for you. And this." She turned to Richard, her voice hardening slightly, "is my cousin who behaved so shamefully the other night." Richard stepped forward, visibly struggling to maintain his composure. The confident, arrogant young man from the viral video was nowhere to be seen. Instead, He looked like a child facing the consequences of his actions for the first time in his life. "Dr. Chen," he began, his voice cracking, "I can't even begin to apologize for what I did. I've spent the last few days learning about your work, about all the lives you've saved, including my cousin's. My actions were inexcusable, and I'll spend the rest of my life trying to make amends." Joe listened quietly, his face showing no judgment, only a deep understanding that made Richard's shame even more acute. Around them, a small crowd had gathered, including Mr. Park from the coffee shop and Amy, who had arrived early for her hospital shift. "Young man," Joe finally spoke, his voice gentle but firm, "the greatest tragedy in life isn't falling down, it's refusing to get back up. Your actions that night were cruel, yes, but what matters more is what you choose to do now." While this scene unfolded, across town at Seattle General Hospital, Dr. Hayes was in a meeting with the hospital board and David Wu, the former patient who had become a successful business owner. They were discussing an ambitious proposal that would change everything. "We're not just talking about offering Dr. Chen his old job back," Wu explained, spreading architectural plans across the conference table. "We're talking about creating an entirely new medical outreach program, with him at the helm if he's willing. A program that would combine traditional medical care with services for the homeless population he's come to know so well." Back at the coffee shop, Richard was sharing his own proposal with Dr. Chen. "I've talked with my father," he said, pulling out a folder of documents. "We want to donate one of our buildings downtown. It could be converted into a medical shelter, providing both immediate care and long-term support for the homeless community. But we need someone who understands both worlds to help us do it right." Joe sat quietly, overwhelmed by the rapid changes in his life. Just days ago, he had been invisible to these same people who now sought his guidance and expertise. Amy, who had been watching the scene unfold, stepped forward and placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Sometimes, Dr. Chen," she said softly, "life has a way of bringing us full circle. You never stopped being a healer, you just found a different way to do it. Maybe now you can combine both worlds." Mr. Park emerged from his coffee shop with fresh cups for everyone, his eyes twinkling. "My shop has been blessed having you read your medical journals here all these months," he said. "Perhaps it's time for you to have a proper office again, but please don't forget about us little people." Joe smiled, his first genuine smile in days. "How could I forget? This corner, this shop, they gave me sanctuary when I needed it most. Sometimes the kindest acts come from the most unexpected places." He looked pointedly at Mr. Park, who had been quietly providing him with coffee and shelter from the elements all these months without ever asking questions. As the morning progressed, more people began arriving, former patients, colleagues, and even some of the homeless individuals Joe had helped during his time on the streets. Each had a story to share about how this humble man had touched their lives, either as the brilliant surgeon he once was or as the compassionate homeless man he had become. Richard watched it all with a growing sense of purpose. His father's words from their recent conversation echoed in his mind, "Sometimes our greatest mistakes can lead to our greatest opportunities for redemption." He had come seeking forgiveness but was finding something far more valuable, a chance to be part of something meaningful. Amy, who had been secretly documenting everything that had happened since that first night, pulled out her phone and showed Joe a local news website. The story of the homeless surgeon had gone national, inspiring discussions about mental health support for medical professionals, the humanitarian crisis of homelessness, and the importance of looking beyond appearances. "Your story is touching people across the country," she explained. "Not just because of your past achievements, but because of who you chose to be even after losing everything. You never stopped caring for others, even when the world stopped caring for you." As the morning sun rose higher over Seattle, casting a warm glow over the gathered crowd, Joe stood up from his usual spot for what would be the last time. He picked up his worn medical journal, looked at the coffee shop that had been his sanctuary, and then at the faces of those around him, Amy, Richard, Lisa, Mr. Park, and all the others whose lives had intersected with his in various ways. "Perhaps," he said thoughtfully, "it's time to write a new chapter. Not to erase the past, but to build something new from all of it, the triumph and the tragedy, the loss and the learning." He turned to Richard. "Your offer of the building, let's discuss it. But with one condition, it must serve everyone, regardless of their circumstances." 2 weeks after the viral video incident, the downtown building donated by the Zhang family was already undergoing transformation. The once empty office space buzzed with activity as construction crews worked to convert it into what would become the Xinjiang Community Medical Center. The name had been Zhou's idea, a symbol of how conflict could transform into collaboration. Richard had thrown himself completely into the project, surprising everyone with his dedication. He could be found on site every day, working alongside the construction teams, learning about the specific needs of homeless individuals from Zhou, and coordinating with medical equipment suppliers. His former friends watched his transformation with a mixture of confusion and growing respect. "The floor plan needs to be welcoming, not intimidating," Zhou explained during a planning meeting, his expertise in both medicine and street life proving invaluable. "Many of these people have had negative experiences with institutions. We need to show them this is different." His suggestions were practical yet compassionate: wide corridors to prevent feeling trapped, plenty of natural light, and comfortable waiting areas that offered dignity along with medical care. Amy had taken a part-time position at the new center while maintaining her hospital duties. She found herself becoming the bridge between the traditional medical community and this innovative new approach. "What Dr. Chen is creating here," she told a local news reporter, "isn't just a medical facility. It's a model for how we can combine professional healthcare with genuine human understanding." The story of the homeless surgeon and the young businessman who had mocked him continued to captivate people. Donations poured in from across the country, allowing the project to expand beyond its initial scope. But more importantly, it was changing how people viewed both the homeless and the concept of redemption. One morning, as Joe walked through the partially completed building, he found Richard sitting alone in what would become the main reception area. The young man was holding a framed photo, the same one Joe had dropped that fateful night, showing him in his surgical days. "I had it restored and enlarged," Richard explained, standing up. "I thought it could hang here, along with the story of how this place came to be. Not to celebrate the past, but to show that sometimes our worst moments can lead to our best opportunities." Joe studied the photo thoughtfully. "You know," he said, "after I lost my family, I thought I'd never find purpose again. I chose homelessness not because I had to, but because I couldn't bear to be in the world I knew without them. But now I understand, sometimes we have to lose our way to find a new path." The center's development attracted attention from medical professionals nationwide. Dr. Hayes had helped establish a rotation program where medical students would spend time at the center, learning not just about medicine but about the human elements of healing. Joe's experience on both sides of the healthcare system made him a uniquely qualified teacher. One day, a group of medical students gathered around Joe as he treated a homeless man's infected foot. "In medical school," he explained while gently cleaning the wound, "they teach you about diseases and treatments. But out here, I learned that healing often starts with simple dignity. Sometimes a kind word does more good than a prescription." The local homeless community, who had known Joe as one of their own, watched these developments with mixed emotions. Some worried that their friend would change, become part of the system that had failed them so many times. But Joe made sure to maintain his connections, often sitting with his former street companions, sharing coffee and listening to their stories. Mr. Park's coffee shop had become an unofficial meeting place for the center's planning team. He'd set aside a special corner, proudly displaying news clippings about the project and photos of the construction progress. From this corner, he would tell customers, a miracle grew. All because people chose to look past appearances and see each other's humanity. Richard's transformation continued to surprise everyone, including himself. One evening, as he helped Joe organize medical supplies, he confessed, "I used to think success was about making money and impressing people. Now I understand it's about making a difference." He paused, then added, "My father says I've grown more in these 2 weeks than in the past 10 years. The center's impact extended beyond medical care. Local businesses, inspired by the story, began creating job opportunities for homeless individuals. A nearby culinary school offered free training programs, and a residential building owner worked with the center to provide transitional housing. Amy watched all of this unfold while maintaining her detailed documentation. "It's not just about medical care anymore," she observed one evening as she and Joe reviewed the day's progress. "You're creating a blueprint for how communities can come together to solve problems we once thought were unsolvable." Joe nodded, looking out the window at the city lights. "You know what's remarkable," he said softly. "When I was at the height of my surgical career, I thought I was doing my most important work. But now I realize, sometimes our greatest contributions come when we're broken open and have to put ourselves back together in a new way." The center was scheduled to open in 1 month, but it had already begun changing lives. Richard's former friends, inspired by his example, had started volunteering with local homeless outreach programs. Medical professionals from across the city were offering their services. Even the media coverage had shifted from sensationalism to serious discussions about homelessness and healthcare. As the sun set over Seattle, casting long shadows through the center's newly installed windows, Joe stood in what would soon be his new office. The walls were still bare except for the restored photo Richard had given him. Next to it hung a simple piece of paper, the coffee cup he had been using as a donation container that fateful night, carefully preserved and framed. "From this cup," read the small plaque beneath it, "grew a fountain of hope. Never underestimate the power of a single moment to change everything." It was Richard's idea to display it, a reminder that transformation often begins in our darkest moments. As the opening day of the Chenjong Community Medical Center drew closer, the impact of its impending launch rippled through Seattle's medical community and beyond. News outlets from across the country had begun arriving in the city, drawn by the unprecedented story of transformation and redemption that had captured the nation's imagination. One particularly meaningful moment came when Joe received an unexpected visitor, Dr. Sandra Powell, the surgeon who had taken over his cases when he disappeared 8 years ago. She found him in his new office, surrounded by boxes of medical supplies he was personally organizing. "You know," she said, leaning against the doorframe, "for years I've been using surgical techniques you developed. We all wondered what happened to you. Some said you'd moved abroad, others thought." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "None of us imagined you were right here all along." Joe looked up from his work, a gentle smile crossing his weathered face. "Sometimes we have to lose ourselves completely to find our true purpose," he replied. "Every patient I treated on the streets taught me something medical school never could." The center itself had evolved beyond its original concept. Thanks to the overwhelming community support and donations, they had been able to add features that addressed the complex needs of homeless individuals. A dental clinic, mental health services, and even a small but well-equipped emergency care unit had been incorporated into the design. Richard, who had surprised everyone with his sustained commitment to the project, had also undergone a remarkable transformation. His father found him one evening working late at the center, reviewing supply logistics with a dedication he'd never shown in the family business. "Son," his father said, watching Richard methodically check inventory, "when I suspended you from the company, I never expected this outcome. You've found your calling here." Richard looked up, surprised by both his father's presence and his words. "Maybe it's time we talked about redirecting some of our real estate developments toward more community-focused projects." Amy had been documenting the center's development for a medical journal, capturing the innovative ways they were breaking down barriers between traditional healthcare and community service. "What makes this place unique," she wrote, "isn't just the medical care, it's the understanding that healing often requires more than medicine." The center had begun offering training sessions for local healthcare providers, teaching them about the unique challenges faced by homeless patients. Joe's experiences on both sides of the system made him an invaluable instructor. The biggest barrier, he explained during one session, isn't always the lack of medical care, it's the lack of dignity in how that care is provided. One morning, about a week before the official opening, Joe arrived at the center to find a small group of his former street companions waiting outside. Led by an elderly man everyone knew as Old Tom, they had come with an unusual request. "Doc," Tom said, nervously twisting his worn cap in his hands, "we know you're going to be real busy running this fancy place, but we were hoping, maybe you could teach some of us basic first aid? Out there, sometimes help is too far away, and if we knew what you know." Joe's eyes lit up with inspiration. This was exactly the kind of peer-to-peer support system he had envisioned. Within hours, he and Amy had drafted a plan for a community health worker program, training interested homeless individuals in basic medical care and safety protocols. The impact of the center was already being felt even before its doors officially opened. Local emergency rooms reported a decrease in non-critical visits as word spread that the center would provide accessible, dignified care. Other cities began sending representatives to study the model, hoping to replicate its approach. Richard's former friends, who had initially distanced themselves from him after the viral video incident, began showing up at the center, first out of curiosity, then with increasing regularity. One of them, a law student, started offering free legal advice to patients navigating disability claims and housing issues. Mr. Park's coffee shop had become an unofficial satellite location for the center, with medical students and homeless individuals alike gathering there for coffee and conversation. He had started a suspended coffee program, where customers could prepay for drinks for those who couldn't afford them. "You see," Joe explained to a documentary filmmaker who was capturing the center's story, "true healing happens in circles, not hierarchies. Everyone here, doctors, patients, volunteers, we're all both givers and receivers of care." The center's approach to mental health was particularly revolutionary. Instead of the traditional clinical setting, they had created comfortable, conversation spaces where patients could speak with counselors in a more relaxed environment. The walls were adorned with art created by homeless artists, many of whom had become regular contributors to the center's culture. One afternoon, as Joe was showing a group of medical students around the nearly completed facility, he paused in front of the framed coffee cup, the same one Richard had kicked that fateful night. "This cup," he told them, "represents both the lowest and highest points of my journey. It reminds us that sometimes our greatest moments of transformation come disguised as our greatest humiliations." Amy, who had been taking notes, looked up from her notebook. "Dr. Chen," she said, "you've created something here that goes beyond medical care. You've shown us how to turn pain into purpose." The center's security team was being trained with a unique approach as well. Instead of the typical hospital security model, they were taught de-escalation techniques and trauma-informed care. Many of the guards were former military veterans who had experienced homelessness themselves, bringing both strength and empathy to their roles. As the sun set on another busy day of preparations, Joe stood in the center's rooftop garden, a space designed for both growing healing herbs and providing a peaceful retreat for patients and staff. Looking out over the city, he could see the corner where he had sat for so many months, reading his medical journals and quietly helping those he could. "You know," he said to Richard, who had joined him on the roof, "when you and your friends mocked me that night, I never imagined it would lead to this. Sometimes life's greatest gifts come wrapped in our most painful moments." Richard nodded, understanding the profound truth in those words. "And sometimes," he added, "our worst mistakes can lead us to our best selves." Together, they watched the city lights come alive, knowing that in just a few days, the center would open its doors and begin a new chapter in both their stories. The morning of the Chenzhong Community Medical Center's opening dawned bright and clear. A substantial crowd had gathered outside the building hours before the scheduled ribbon-cutting ceremony. Among them were medical professionals, local officials, media representatives, and most importantly, members of the homeless community who had known Joe during his years on the streets. Inside, Joe stood in his office, adjusting the tie Amy had bought him for the occasion. His reflection in the window showed a man transformed, not just by the new clothes, but by the renewed sense of purpose that radiated from within. On his desk sat a small, worn photo of his late wife and daughter, placed there that morning for the first time in years. "I think they would be proud," Amy said softly from the doorway, having guessed where his thoughts had wandered. "Not just of this place, but of how you never stopped helping others, even in your darkest times." The center itself was a marvel of thoughtful design. The entrance opened into a warm, welcoming space filled with natural light. Local artists, many of them homeless or formerly homeless, had contributed murals that transformed institutional walls into galleries of hope and healing. The registration desk was designed to be accessible from a seated position, with no imposing barriers between staff and patients. Richard arrived early, personally checking every detail one last time. He had surprised everyone by completing a basic emergency medical technician (EMT) course over the past weeks, determined to be more than just an administrator. "I want to understand our patients' needs firsthand," he had explained to his impressed father. The ceremony began with an unexpected moment. Old Tom, still in his worn jacket but with a newly earned first aid certification pinned proudly to his chest, stepped forward to speak. His voice, though shaking at first, grew stronger as he shared his story. "Most folks look at us street people and see problems to be solved," he said. Doc Chen looked at us and saw human beings who could help solve problems. Now, thanks to his teaching, there are 15 of us trained as community health workers. We can help our own people, with dignity. The mayor, who had come to cut the ribbon, found herself moved to tears by Tom's speech. This wasn't the usual ceremonial appearance, she was witnessing something revolutionary. When she spoke, she deviated from her prepared remarks. "Today, we're not just opening a medical center," she declared. "We're opening our eyes to a new way of addressing healthcare and homelessness. Dr. Chen hasn't just created a facility, he's created a model for how we can combine professional expertise with lived experience." As the ribbon was cut, the crowd erupted in applause. But Joe's attention was drawn to a quiet scene at the back. A homeless woman had approached the entrance, clutching a sick child. Without hesitation, he slipped away from the ceremonies and did what he had always done, he helped someone in need. The center's first day of operation proved the effectiveness of their innovative approach. Patients were greeted by pairs of staff, one medical professional and one community health worker who had experienced homelessness. This dual perspective helped bridge the gap between clinical care and real-world challenges. In the dental clinic, a formerly homeless artist received his first dental care in decades. "I haven't smiled in years," he said, touching his restored teeth in wonder. "Now I can face my grandchildren without shame." His story highlighted how medical care wasn't just about health, it was about restoring dignity. The mental health services area, with its comfortable conversation spaces and trauma-informed approach, quickly filled with people who had previously avoided traditional psychiatric care. "It doesn't feel like we're being processed through a system," one patient explained. "It feels like we're being heard." Richard spent the day working alongside the EMTs, learning and helping wherever he could. During a quiet moment, he found himself treating a young man who reminded him of himself just weeks ago, privileged, slightly arrogant, and completely unaware of his own blind spots. "You know," Richard told him while bandaging a minor injury, "a month ago, I was a different person." Sometimes it takes a profound humbling to open your eyes to what really matters. The young man listened, initially skeptical but gradually engaged by Richard's story of transformation. By late afternoon, the center had served over 100 patients, but it was the small moments that proved most meaningful. Joe watched as old Tom carefully demonstrated proper wound cleaning to a younger homeless man, his weathered hands gentle and confident. In the children's area, a formerly homeless mother who had trained as a community health worker comforted a scared child before their vaccination. Amy, continuing her documentation of the center's impact, captured countless moments of healing that went beyond medical care. She photographed a doctor sitting on the floor to be at eye level with a homeless child, a community health worker sharing his own recovery story with an addicted patient, and volunteers from Mr. Park's coffee shop delivering hot drinks to those waiting. As evening approached, the center's emergency care unit faced its first major test. A homeless man arrived in critical condition, suffering from severe pneumonia. The team's response demonstrated the perfect integration of professional expertise and street-level understanding. While the medical team worked to stabilize him, his friends from the street were welcomed into a nearby waiting area, treated with respect rather than suspicion. "This is what healthcare should look like," Dr. Hayes remarked, watching the scene unfold. "It's not just about treating symptoms, it's about healing the whole person, and by extension, the whole community." The day's final patient was a young woman who had been living in her car. She came in for a minor infection but found something she didn't expect: hope. The center's social workers connected her with temporary housing, job training programs, and most importantly, a community that cared. As the sun set on the center's first day, Joe gathered the staff for a brief meeting. Looking at the faces around him, medical professionals, former street dwellers turned health workers, volunteers, and administrators, he saw the embodiment of his vision for healing. "Today," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "we've proven that when we break down the barriers between helper and helped, between professional and patient, we create something powerful. Every person who walked through those doors today carried both needs and gifts. Our job is to honor both." 6 months after the Chenjiang Community Medical Center opened its doors, the impact of that fateful night when a group of young men mocked a homeless man had rippled far beyond anything anyone could have imagined. The center had become a beacon of hope, its model of integrated care drawing attention from healthcare providers and community organizations worldwide. On a crisp autumn morning, much like the one when this story began, Joe stood at his office window, watching the sunrise paint the sky in shades of pink and gold. The street corner where he had once sat was visible from here, though it looked different now. Mr. Park had turned it into a small garden with benches, a place where people could rest and find respite. "Dr. Chen?" Amy's voice drew his attention. She entered carrying a thick binder, the completed documentation of the center's first 6 months. "The numbers are incredible. We've served over 5,000 patients, helped 200 people transition into permanent housing, and trained 50 community health workers. But it's the personal stories that really tell our success." The center had evolved in ways none of them had anticipated. What started as a medical facility had grown into a comprehensive community hub. The rooftop garden now produced fresh vegetables for a small cafe staffed by formerly homeless individuals learning culinary skills. The waiting areas had become impromptu classrooms where community health workers shared their knowledge. Richard, who had once been the face of privileged ignorance, had become an unexpected champion for change. His father's real estate company had shifted its focus to developing affordable housing projects, with Richard leading the initiative to integrate healthcare services into these developments. "You know what's remarkable?" Richard said during a board meeting. 6 months ago, I thought success meant having the most expensive car in the parking lot. Now I measure it by the number of lives we've helped transform." His former friends, inspired by his example, had started similar initiatives in their own fields: law, finance, and business. The center's impact on the medical community had been profound. Medical schools across the country had begun incorporating modules based on their integrated care model. Students now spent time learning not just about diseases and treatments, but about the social determinants of health and the importance of dignity in care. One morning, Joe received a letter that brought tears to his eyes. It was from a young doctor in Boston who had read about the center's work. "Your story helped me find my way back," she wrote. "After losing a patient, I was ready to quit medicine. But seeing how you transformed your own tragedy into healing for others gave me hope. We're now starting a similar program here. The Community Health Worker Program, which had started with old Tom and 14 others, had become a model of peer support. These formerly homeless individuals, with their combination of medical training and lived experience, had proven invaluable in reaching those who traditionally avoided healthcare settings. Remember when I asked you to teach us first aid? Old Tom reminisced one day, now wearing a neat uniform with his certification badges. I never imagined we'd end up here. Yesterday, I helped talk a young man into getting treatment for his addiction. He listened to me because I've walked in his shoes. Amy's documentation had grown into something larger, a blueprint for other communities wanting to replicate their success. She had captured not just the medical outcomes, but the human stories that made the center unique. Her work was being published in major medical journals, changing how healthcare providers thought about serving marginalized populations. The center's mental health services had proven particularly revolutionary. By combining professional care with peer support and dignity-centered approaches, they had achieved breakthrough results in treating trauma and addiction. The comfortable conversation spaces had become safe harbors where healing could begin. Mr. Park's coffee shop had evolved too. What started as a simple cafe had become a vital community space. He had hired several formerly homeless individuals, training them as baristas and managers. Coffee brings people together, he would say, but kindness keeps them coming back. One day, a group of business students visited the center as part of their social entrepreneurship course. Joe shared with them the full story, from his days as a celebrated surgeon through his years on the street, to the night of mockery that had unexpectedly led to this place of healing. The greatest lesson I've learned, he told them, is that our lowest moments often contain the seeds of our greatest purpose. When those young men mocked me that night, they thought they were seeing my shame. Instead, they were witnessing the beginning of their own transformation. The center had begun offering evening classes, teaching everything from basic healthcare to financial literacy. The classrooms were always full, with housed and homeless community members learning side by side. The barriers that had once seemed so insurmountable were dissolving through education and understanding. Lisa, Richard's cousin whose life Joe had saved years ago, had become a regular volunteer. She brought her children to help in the rooftop garden, teaching them the value of service and the importance of seeing beyond appearances. My kids need to understand, she explained, that every person has value, regardless of their circumstances. As the 6-month anniversary of the center's opening approached, Joe received news that brought his journey full circle. The American Medical Association was presenting him with their highest humanitarian award, not for his earlier surgical innovations, but for revolutionizing how healthcare could be delivered to marginalized communities. During the award ceremony, Joe stood at the podium, looking out at the faces before him, medical professionals, community health workers, former patients, and supporters. Richard sat in the front row, beside his father and Lisa. Amy was there with her camera, documenting this moment for future generations. 6 months ago, Joe began, this center was born from an act of mockery that could have deepened the divide between the housed and homeless in our community. Instead, it became a bridge. We've learned that true healing happens when we stop seeing people as problems to be solved and start seeing them as partners in solving problems. He paused, looking at the award in his hands. This recognition doesn't belong to me alone. It belongs to every person who has walked through our doors, whether seeking help or offering it. It belongs to the community health workers who turned their struggles into strength. It belongs to the young man who found the courage to transform his mistake into a mission. As Joe concluded his speech, the audience rose in a standing ovation. But his attention was drawn to a small group at the back of the room, some of his former street companions, now dressed in clean clothes but still carrying the wisdom of their experiences. They nodded to him, a gesture of respect between people who understood that sometimes the longest journey leads right back to where you're meant to be. The sun set on another day at the Chinjiang Community Medical Center, its windows glowing with warm light, a beacon of hope in the gathering dusk. Inside, healing continued in all its forms: medical, emotional, spiritual. The story that began with mockery had transformed into a symphony of compassion, proof that sometimes life's most profound transformations begin in its darkest moments.